This is Birmingham, the second largest city in England. And like any other city, Birmingham people love entertainment. And the entertainment in question in this videotape film is cinemas, Birmingham cinemas. The rise, the greatness, and now sadly the decline of these cinemas.
The year was 1896. The first picture shows in Birmingham were in fairgrounds as sideshows and were known as the Bioscope Show. The Bioscope usually had an elaborately carved and gilded wooden front lit by arc lamps, a mechanical organ, and sometimes a stage or platform on which dancing girls would perform to entertain the onlookers. The proprietor would stand there, urging everyone to come and see the films, which would be described as high class, moral, refined, and pleasing to ladies and children. The fairground shows soon had other competitors. The next important step forward in the exhibition of motion pictures came in the form of converted shops. As often as not, the ordinary shop business was still carried on in the front part of the premises. In Birmingham, like other cities throughout the country, there were music halls where they'd show moving pictures as part of the programme. One of these music halls, the Empire, used to stand in Hurst Street, where the Locarno Dance Hall now stands. Not forgetting another old variety theatre, the Newtown Palace. The artistic splendour of the provincial cinema is shown here. This cinema used to stand where the Piccadilly Arcade now stands. The statues that stood in the foyer the marvellous plasterwork on the walls and ceilings are an example from the years before the First World War and of the beautiful palaces of light. The gentleman standing at the bottom of the steps outside the Curzon Hall is Waller Jeffs. He screened his first programme at the Curzon Hall in 1901. His manager there was another showman, Irving Bosco. Later on, Waller Jeffs returned the compliment and managed one for him, the Picture House at Harborne. Irving Bosco retired before the advent of the talkies, and when he died in 1946, many of the buildings in which he'd shown films had disappeared or changed their use. His most lasting monument in Birmingham is the old Villa Cross Cinema in Handsworth, which still survives as a bingo hall today. It's a triumph of architecture. No one can cross its threshold without feeling a sense of exhilaration. Here, music, colour, soft lighting all combine to provide an atmosphere of joyness in which the mind can more easily cast aside those worries and problems of everyday life. This then must be one of the finest examples of cinema architecture of the pleasure palaces in Birmingham, and most certainly a fine tribute to a great showman of the early 20s, Irving Bosco. It wasn't until after the first part of this century that new buildings were designed for the exclusive exhibition of motion pictures. A very early example of this was the old moving picture palace in Station Street, later to be called the Tatler and now the Classic. Another very early example of a silent cinema is the Palace in Saltley, which still exists as a cinema today. After the end of the First World War, larger and more palatial cinemas began to be erected in a wide variety of styles. Growth and prosperity produced many fine buildings in and around the city, and here are a few examples. The Beaufort, that used to stand in Ward End, was a very fine example of Tudor design, with its church-like dome windows. When the first talking picture was shown in 1929, it arrived at the Futurist Cinema in John Bright Street. Many proprietors thought it would be a passing phase at first. They were not. Talking equipment was installed, making cinema musicians and pianists redundant. In the late 20s, another company appeared on the cinema scene called Associated British Cinemas. This company acquired quite a few existing private cinemas, but also built some of their own. A typical example shown here was the Robin Hood Cinema, that stood on the main Birmingham to Stratford Road and was originally built as a theatre. Their flagship cinema in Birmingham was the Forum in New Street, and the Alhambra was Birmingham's regional office for the company. The temple-like frontage to the Edgbaston Cinema and the Oak at Selly Oak had a gigantically wide front. One of their later cinemas was the Gaiety that stood in Coleshill Street in the city, proudly displaying their company sign. Oscar Deutsch was born in Birmingham in 1893. His father was one of the founders of Deutsch & Brenner Limited, non-ferrous scrap metal merchants. He joined the family business when he left King Edward's Grammar School in 1910. In 1928, he built his first cinema at Brierley Hill in Staffordshire, and his second in 1930 at Perry Bar in Birmingham. Neither of these cinemas bear any resemblance to the Odeons, which he built between 1934 and 1939. In 1933, Oscar Deutsch commissioned Harry Whedon to produce designs for the interior of the Odeon Cinema at Worley in Birmingham. The Deutsch & Brenner factory had been redeveloped and enlarged to Harry Whedon's designs. But it was a casual reference to the Birchfield Cinema, which Harry Whedon had designed in 1913, that persuaded Oscar Deutsch to regard him as anything other than a very competent architect. Harry Whedon was also educated at King Edward's Grammar School, Birmingham, and was born in 1887, making him 6 years older than Oscar Deutsch. Oscar Deutsch had been so impressed with Harry Whedon's designs for the decor at Worley, and by the efficiency of his organisation, that towards the end of 1934, he was commissioned to design Odeons at King's Standing and Sutton Coldfield. The basic element most frequently adopted was a fin or tower, which would display the Odeon sign at high level. The second basic element was the contrasting use of high-quality tiling. Tiling was frequently used to emphasise the tower and other features. With few exceptions, all Odeons designed by Harry Whedon bore a strong resemblance to the original designs of King's Standing and Sutton Coldfield. Having found a successful formula, there seemed to be little point in looking for something better. One factor that added greatly to the workload of the Whedon's office was the whims of the local planning authorities, not all of which thought the Odeon style suited the character of their high street, as in this case at Shirley, without a tower. In late 1938, Deutsch started negotiating a takeover of the Gaumont circuit, which gave him control of more than 600 cinemas. The last Odeon cinema to open up in Birmingham was the Odeon Queensway, and the Odeon's flagship cinema in the city is the Odeon New Street. The 30s produced the Super Cinema, at first to denote a degree of luxury and a seating capacity in many cases in excess of 1,000. But later it was strongly associated with emerging architectural styles. Design became more functional, and if anything, even more firmly than ever, creating a tradition of what the cinemas should look like. Most Birmingham cinemas were built in the mid to late 30s and were of various designs. There were also smaller circuits, like the Clifton circuit in the late 30s, as construction of super cinemas gained momentum. Clifton was also associated with the construction of the Grove Cinema in the Dudley Road area of the city, and another wonderful building, the Beacon at Great Bar, which had strong resemblances to the Odeon at Worley. The declaration of war on September the 3rd, 1939, meant that most cinema plans had to go into cold storage. At first, all cinemas were closed as a safety precaution. When they reopened, they had bigger audiences than ever and flourished. But sadly, this was not to last long, and after the war, no cinema building took place in Birmingham. Towards the end of the 40s, no one really noticed the one or two cinemas that closed. Some that closed changed over to other businesses, such as art centres. And even the little news theatre in the High Street didn't escape closure. To bring back the lost audiences, the film companies tried stereophonic sound, but this was not enough to win back the dwindling audiences. The first part of the 60s saw the introduction of a new craze from America, 10-pin bowling. After the bowling craze, we saw the bingo craze, which started in the middle 60s.
5 and 4, 54. 1 and 5, 15. 5 and 1, 51.
Like 10-pin bowling, it did save a few cinema buildings from demolition. Unfortunately, we kept reading articles like these in the local papers about more and more cinemas under the threat of closure and maybe demolition. But the history of these palaces of light in Birmingham is probably not all that different from the history of cinemas in other parts of the country. By the end of the 70s, the remaining cinema goers were in the 16 to 25 age group, plus a few pensioners at the matinees. In recent years, Birmingham has lost most of its local cinemas, apart from one or two, and has been left with a handful of city cinemas with multiple screens. While this video film was in production, we learned of two more cinema closures: the King's Norton Cinema and the ABC's flagship, the Forum in New Street. Having talked of decline, closure, bowling and bingo, it's worth considering one final point that is impossible to shatter, however unrealistic it is. That in 1956, as shown here, there were 120 cinemas in and around Birmingham, but now in the 80s, we're left with only 10.